Thank you for joining us tonight for Wild Coachella. I was thinking about it, and do you know, Dr. Barrows, the last time we gathered for Wild Coachella was at the Palm Desert Center, and it was March the 4th, and we had the wonderful Jennifer Ackerman with us talking about the genius of birds. So that was more than a year ago. It probably seems to some of us like it was 5 years ago. Others, it might seem like just yesterday, but it was a little more than a year ago. And we're so excited to be able to bring Wild Coachella back, at least in this format for now, and we hope in the future, back at the Palm Desert Center on the stage, where I, Tamara Hedges, am the executive director. And it's again, such a pleasure, and it's wonderful that we're kicking it off with Dr. Chad Hansen this evening. Before we get started, we have some thank yous to do. I want to thank the team that put this lecture series together, which include Dr. Barrows and myself, and Maggie Downs, who's behind the scenes here, and Colin Barrows, who's behind the scenes here, and one other person that I think is in our audience that I can't see right now, but that's Elizabeth Erickson. So thank you to our team that put together this lecture series. Oh, and Amy O'Neill, who we couldn't do what we do without Amy O'Neill. So thank you all. I want to thank the UCR Palm Desert Center partners. Again, we couldn't do what we do if we didn't have our UCR Palm Desert Center partners. Because of your kindness, your generosity, your support, we're able to continue on with our programming even during a difficult time like this. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts for your support. I'd also like to acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and the current caretakers of this land, water, and air. That's the Cahuilla, the Tongva, Los Sueño, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting space is home to many Indigenous people from all over the world. And when I say the meeting space, I mean UCR at large on these lands, including UCR faculty, staff, and students. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. We have our chat box. We hope that you will utilize the chat box and say hi. Maggie Downs is there giving you lots of links and resources there as we go through this evening. And we have a Q&A box as well. And that's where we would like you to put your questions for Dr. Hansen. And Colin Barrows will be taking us through those questions. You can put them in at any time during the talk. You don't have to save them up. You can put them in there, but just know that we'll address them at the end of Dr. Hansen's lecture. So now it is my great pleasure to turn it over to my colleague and my friend, Dr. Cameron Barrows.
Thank you, Tamara, and welcome all of you. It's so great to be able to chat with you once again. I really do miss seeing you in person, but this is second best. Just wanted to give you a little bit of an update on what we're doing with our programs here with regard to conservation biology at the Palm Desert Center. As many of you are probably very well aware, we did have the opportunity to teach a climate stewards class this past fall, we were the pilot or the experimental class. Nobody had ever taught it before, and we were the first ones. And it worked out all right. We did it all virtually. I think it worked well in many ways. We were able to pull in students from a much broader area. I think we had some students joining us from Missouri or Illinois or as far away as that, certainly up into Santa Barbara and beyond. And so one of the advantages of doing these sorts of programs virtually is that we don't have to be limited by geographic area, which is a really good thing. We did postpone teaching the California Naturalist class this spring, which is when we usually teach that. Our hope is we're going to teach it in the fall. The reason, of course, is that it's so important for that class especially to be able to get into the field together and to walk on the sand dunes and walk in through the desert together and talk about the various relationships that we're seeing there. So we're looking forward to doing that this fall, and it all depends on how the pandemic looks at that point, but I'm hopeful on that. The other thing that we've been doing is trying to extend and maintain our community of naturalists that have taken these courses in the past. And to that end, we've created a very active group called the Community Science Collaborative. And a lot of them, I'm sure, are in the audience right now. But these are folks that we meet once a week and we go out in the field and we are distanced and we wear masks and we are safe, but we are out there experiencing nature and learning about it and collecting data that helps us understand how animals and plants are responding to the changes that we're seeing there. And one of the fun things that we did as part of that is create a special patch. And I don't see if you can see it right there, but those of you who participate on a regular basis gets to put these patches on your clothes or your backpack. And so when you do hikes around here and you see somebody with that patch, that's somebody who knows what they're talking about and somebody you can ask good important questions to. So that's the update on what's happening so far. Right now, I wanted to introduce Dr. Chad Hansen. Just to give you a brief background, he went to UCLA and got his bachelor's degree back in 1991, which makes him way younger than I am. And then he did something that most scientists don't do, which is in 1995, he went to the University of Oregon and got a law degree. I think it served him well because soon after that, he created what is his home organization now, the John Muir Project. And they do everything from science and outreach, but also they get involved in legal watchdog type activities. So they depend, or his law degree has served him well there. Then in 2007, he got his PhD in ecology from UC Davis, which is where I got my bachelor's degree. So we've crossed paths a little bit there. And since then, he has published over 20 papers in peer-reviewed journals about the topic that he's going to be talking about this evening, which is the influence of fire in forests and what we've gotten wrong so far, and hopefully we're going to get right. I think what you're all going to find out is that whatever preconception you had about the role of fire in forests is probably wrong, and Chad's going to set us right. So I'm going to turn this over to Chad right now and let him start his program.
Thank you, Dr. Burrows. Appreciate that. Hi, everybody. I'm Chad Hansen, a forest and fire ecologist with the John Muir Project. I'm going to talk tonight about snag forest habitat. And let's see, I'll wait for the first slide to come up here. I don't know if you all can see it on your end. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so snag forest habitat is a unique type of forest habitat that has really interesting ecological relationships that we're not used to thinking about when we think about forest ecosystems. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Next slide, please. All right, so we're used to hearing this narrative that a healthy forest is a green forest, where in other words you have green live trees, and the extension of that is that the healthiest forest would be a forest with just sort of unbroken green live trees from ridgetop to ridgetop. And the reality is what we're learning is it's more complicated than that. Certainly live green trees and patches of mostly live green trees are incredibly important in forest ecosystems. And there are entire groups of plant and animals that are associated with that. But turns out there are entire groups of plant and animal species that are associated with a different type of forest habitat, which we call snag forest. Next slide. So this is an area that burned in a fire at low intensity. This burned in the 2001 Star Fire in the northern Sierra Nevada. I took this picture sometime after the fire. This is an area that burned at low intensity. It was a very, very dense old forest and multi-layered canopy, and the fire just crept along the forest floor, despite the fact that it's a very, very dense forest. But this is what we've been told for decades is the ideal fire situation, where the fire just sort of creeps along the forest floor, maybe consumes a few seedlings and some pine needles and some twigs, but really doesn't change the forest in any significant way. And it's true that there are some species that really like the dense old forest with high canopy cover, and they prefer the areas where the fire doesn't change the forest much. But that's not true of all species. And it's surprising how many like it hot, in a sense. Next slide, please. This is snag forest habitat. And I took this picture about 300 meters away from the previous picture. This is an area where the fire was creeping along, and then the wind kicked up and it burned much more intensely, because these fire patterns are largely driven by wind, weather, and climate variables. And this particular patch burned very, very hot, and it killed all the trees in a fairly significant patch of forest. And I took this particular picture at 12 years post-fire. It started naturally regenerating with conifers, with shrubs, with black oaks, dogwoods. It started regenerating the first year after the fire. But then there was even more in the second year, and more in the fourth year, and the 8th year. And by 12 years post-fire, we had this wonderful, rich, complex snag forest habitat that's characterized by standing dead trees, which are snags, down logs after the snags fall, natural conifer regeneration, Douglas fir, white fir, incense cedar, and Ponderosa pine and sugar pine in this area mostly. And then, of course, many different native shrub species. Some of them ceanothus, some manzanita, and then a mix of dogwoods and black oak. And so you had this really rich, complex system. And it turns out there are different components of snag forest that are used by different species. Next slide, please. And so first, before I talk about the different denizens of the snag forest habitat, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history. We've been told a narrative, a communicated narrative for decades, that historically the forests were all open and park-like, and the fires were so frequent that there was hardly any understory, no shrubs or very little, very few small trees. It was mostly just kind of widely spaced mature trees and low intensity fire that was very frequent. And it is true that open forests with very frequent fire within any given forest type, like Ponderosa pine, those frequent fire forest types, there was always a portion that was open and relatively low density in terms of trees per acre. But it turns out that most of the forests were actually moderately dense or very dense, and actually had a real mix of fire intensities. And that includes in Ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests. And what you see here is a map created by a very early US Geological Survey researcher. Those white crosshatched patches is the map created by those researchers. And I overlaid that on top of modern vegetation type. The light gray on the left is the western lower montane forest, mostly Ponderosa pine. And then on the right, the medium gray, that's east side forest types, mostly Jeffrey pine, east side pine. And then in the middle, the darker is the upper montane, mostly true fir like red fir and some lodgepole pine. Okay, but what you can see there is there are these large high intensity fire patches in these forest types, including in Ponderosa pine and mixed conifer. And these were mapped in the 1800s. And so basically what this shows is large high intensity fire patches that occurred sometime between 1800 and in the late 1890s. And we're talking about areas where the fire killed 75 to 100% of the trees. And if you look at the scale on the bottom, you can see it's in kilometers, but you can see some of these are very, very large. They're thousands of hectares in size. In fact, if you can convert it to acres, some of these are 20 to 30,000 acres in size, these patches. So point is that there's a long history of mixed intensity fire, including some large high intensity fire patches. Most of them are small, but some are quite big, and they were historically. Next slide, please. And this is just a quote from that US Geological Survey researcher who started in the early 1880s and finished the research in the 1890s and submitted the report to Congress in 1902. And the researcher was John Lieberg. And this was done with an enormous team of surveyors who spent years doing this in the northern Sierra Nevada. And this quote just shows you this area that this mix of dense, mature forest, large areas of standing dead trees or snags, what I call snag forest habitat, dense undergrowth, in other words, shrub cover, what I call montane chaparral, and then different stringers of live trees and small groups of trees rising out of what he calls the brush. In other words, that's natural conifer regeneration, growing up through the montane chaparral. And so you had this really complex mix of conditions created by mixed intensity fire. Next slide. And it's not just the Sierra Nevada or even just California. This is true in these forest types, even in the frequent fire forest types, Ponderosa pine and mixed conifer across the West. And it's also true in the Southern California mountains. This photo is a large high intensity fire patch that created snag forest habitat across a large area in 1933 on Big Pine Mountain on what is now the Los Padres National Forest. Next slide. And this just shows a reconstruction using very early General Land Office data that reconstructed fire history in the 1800s. And in the Sierra Nevada, and you can see the red areas are high intensity fire patches, and green is mixed and blue is low. And what you can see is, of course, this wasn't just a homogeneous low intensity fire system. This was very dynamic with a mix of fire intensities, including high intensity fire that was creating and regenerating new stands of forest, creating snag forest habitat and regenerating new stands. Next slide. And interestingly, I spent long hours and many days and weeks in the National Archives looking at some early 20th century forest surveys conducted by the Forest Service not long after the agency began. And this was in the Sierra Nevada. And it turns out that some earlier studies had left out accidentally the vast majority of the tree data. They had only included live mature trees of certain species. But these National Archives data sets from a century ago were absolutely rich with data on the small trees and the non-timber species like black oak, for example. And when you added those all together, it turns out that the tree density in terms of trees per acre were 17 times higher than was previously reported in Ponderosa pine forest types, and 7 times higher than the 30 trees per acre that was previously reported in mixed conifer forests. Of course, there was wide variability. There were areas that were very open and park-like. That was a minority of the forest, but they were certainly part of the mix. But there were a lot of areas that were moderately dense or very dense, in some cases, thousands of trees per acre, when you include all the oaks, the small trees, the large trees, everything, the conifers and the non-conifers. And so this was a very complex and heterogeneous system historically. Next slide, please. The other thing that we found when we went through these National Archives records, the original records, is that the other aspect of the data that had been left out or omitted by the earlier studies was explicit notes of high intensity fire patches. In fact, in many cases, not only were there notes, but there were maps. And when we included these data, which we thought were just a treasure trove, the previous assumption that historically these mixed conifer and ponderosa pine forests only had an average of 5% high intensity fire, that average came up to 27% once we included all the data that had been missing from the previous studies. And in various research that has come out since then, it's ranged from about 22% to up to about 39%, depending upon the area and the time period. And so the bottom line is, yes, these areas, these forests, these frequent fire forest types had mostly low and moderate intensity fire, but there was a very significant high intensity fire component. And that's a really important thing to understand when we're talking about snag forest habitat, because it turns out that that high intensity fire component has been there for a very, very long time, long before the existence of humans and deep into evolutionary history. Next slide, please. And in the more recent history, long before fire suppression, or predating industrial fire suppression, there are actually records that show that we actually had a lot more fire in the Western landscape and in the U.S. as a whole, and in California specifically. We had a lot more fire historically than we have now. So it's true that we have more fire now than we had in the 1970s and the 1980s. That's absolutely true. But that's not a good ecological baseline. And sometimes people misunderstand our current fire patterns because they use a baseline from just a few decades ago, when in reality, what we really need to compare to is the baseline prior to fire suppression. And it turns out that we had, having tens of millions of acres burn in the US in a given year was pretty average and pretty typical. Whereas now, if we have a 10 million acre year, they call it a record. That only is true if you look at the 1970s till present, but it doesn't represent the ecological history of these areas. That's important to realize. Next slide. So, one thing that's really key about this is that, as I mentioned, historically, these fires burned mostly at low and moderate intensity, but they had a significant high intensity fire component before fire suppression. What's interesting is the same thing is true now. Even the biggest fires are mostly low and moderate intensity. This is the Rim Fire. This is a 257,000 acre fire that burned in 2013 in the Sierra Nevada. The largest fire in modern record keeping at that time. We've had a couple of bigger ones since then, at least one. And it turns out it's mostly low and moderate intensity as well. Now, those red areas are the high intensity fire patches. When I ask people to tell me what percentage they think that represents, usually they think it's like 30 or 40%, because the color red really jumps out at you visually. Especially when it's that kind of shocking red that they use for fire severity maps. So it's a little misleading visually. That red, and we've done the math on this, it amounts to 19.9% of the total. So this fire was just a little bit over 80% low and moderate intensity. Next slide. And in fact, oftentimes when you see fire severity maps with those large red areas shortly after the fire, it does not capture some of the adaptations that these conifer species have. These are Jeffrey pines. I took this picture in the upper left shortly after the lake fire that burned in 2015, just a few miles from where I live. And those trees, of course, don't have any green needles on them. They looked dead. The needles were killed by the radiant heat from the fire. But the terminal buds at the end of the branches survived. And the lower right represents that same area. I took that picture a year later. In other words, a year after the fire had occurred, a little more than a year, actually, about 14, 15 months after the fire. And basically, these are trees that looked dead, but absolutely were not dead. They produced new green foliage from the surviving terminal buds. And they basically looked like they were barely scorched. There were a few trees in there that did die, and you can see those snags in there. But the bottom line is, an area that looked like 100% tree mortality, or very close to it, was actually closer to about 15% tree mortality. Next slide. And this is a process that we call flushing. It's an adaptation that Ponderosa pines, Jeffrey pines, a number of other conifer species have, where they produce new foliage from the surviving terminal buds. And this is an up-close picture where you can see that. I took this picture in the Rim Fire in the early May of the first year post-fire. And so it's really important to understand this, because a lot of the trees that look dead are not. Now, of course, if the flames go all the way up to the tops of the trees, now those are dead trees, those are snags, and they have their own important value. But if they have brown needles, there's a really good chance that those trees are not dead. And if you just wait for 1 year after the fire, they'll typically produce a whole new crown of green foliage. Next slide. And just to illustrate the point further, this is the Wallow Fire that burned in 2011 in eastern Arizona, 565,000 acres. I can't recall if it was 12% or 16% high intensity fire. I think it was 12. Yes, I think that's right. So, bottom line is that there's a significant component of high intensity fire, but they're mostly low and moderate, just like they were historically. The main difference is we just have a lot less fire in our forests now than we did when fires were naturally burning, in a mix between lightning strikes and wildland fires from lightning strikes and Native American cultural burning, before both were suppressed and began to be actively and aggressively suppressed about a century ago. Next slide. All right, so getting to some of the denizens of the snag forest. This is on the right there, that's the blackback woodpecker. And I've been studying the blackback woodpecker for almost 2 decades now. And it's a really interesting species. You'll see that it's got a grub in its mouth there. That's the larva of a wood-boring beetle. And wood-boring beetles, there are dozens of species, they're native beetles, and they have evolved over many millennia to depend on recently fire-killed trees for their reproduction. In fact, they've developed receptors in their bodies to detect wildland fire by smoke or by heat, depending on the species. And they will make a beeline for a fire area. They're actually pretty decent flyers. They're large beetles, and they land on the charred bark of a fire-killed tree shortly after the flames have passed and the snag has cooled. And they lay their eggs. The larvae bore through the charred bark into the wood of the tree, and they develop over time into an adult. And then they later emerge and they fly away, and they either go through another cycle in the same fire, or they fly away and they look for the next fire. While they're in their larval stage, deep in the wood of these fire-killed trees, these snags, that's the primary food source for numerous different native woodpecker species, including the blackback woodpecker. And these woodpeckers depend on the larvae of these beetles for the food they need to survive. One blackback woodpecker eats 13,500 wood-boring beetle larvae every single year. That's how much it needs to survive and to raise its young. And so you need a lot of fire-killed trees for the blackback woodpecker and similar species. Next slide, please. And this is a monogamous species, the blackback woodpecker, like some of the others in this genus. And every spring, the male will excavate between 2 and 4 new nest cavities in these fire-killed trees in their territory. And the female every spring will pick the one that she likes the best, and that's where they raise their young. And what that means is all the cavities that they excavate and that they don't use in a given year, or the ones from a previous year, those are available for all the other cavity nesting species in the forest to use, species that need cavities to raise their young, but cannot create their own cavities. Bluebirds, nuthatches, flying squirrels, chipmunks, dozens and dozens of bird and small mammal species depend on blackback woodpeckers and other woodpeckers that are strong excavators, like white-headed woodpeckers, which we have in our mountains down here, and hairy woodpeckers. They depend on those to create cavities. Even other woodpecker species that are weak excavators, like northern flickers, depend on these woodpecker species to create nest cavities. Next slide. So I always show this one just to get a sense, just to give people a visual sense of the perfect camouflage that blackback woodpeckers have in their natural habitat, which is, against the charred bark of a fire-killed tree. And if you look carefully, I don't know if you can find the blackback woodpecker there, but if you advance to the next slide, you will see an arrow that points to the top. There it is. All right, so the tip of the arrow is touching the top of her head. This is a female blackback woodpecker in a snag forest area, and you can just see how wonderfully camouflaged she is. I was standing about 25 feet from her when I took this picture. The next slide. And of course, in the understory, when high intensity fire occurs, you have this wonderful stimulation of native flowering shrubs and wildflowers that attract this incredible richness and diversity of native flying insects, including many different species of bees, butterflies, dragonflies, moths, and that, of course, provides food for fly-catching birds and bats. Next slide, please. And so you have this rich interconnected system. And in addition, then you have many different species of shrub nesting birds that are nesting in the shrubs in the understory in these snag forests. Next slide. As well as many different species and a high abundance of small mammals in the snag forest, because that natural conifer regeneration, those pockets, the natural regeneration of shrubs and down logs are great habitat for small mammals. And that provides great prey food source for hawks, owls, and carnivores like Pacific fishers. Next slide. And in fact, interestingly, as fire severity goes up, bird abundance tends to go up as well in most data sets. Interestingly, so does bird diversity in most cases as well. And so there's a rich body of literature that we discussed in a book that I co-authored 5.5 years ago called The Ecological Importance of Mixed Severity Fires, Nature's Phoenix. And we summarize hundreds of studies basically indicating that snag forest habitat is not a loss of forest. It's not a loss of wildlife habitat. It's not damaged. It's not destroyed like we hear oftentimes in the media. In fact, snag forest habitat is an ecological treasure. And what the data are indicating is that it's comparable to old growth forest in terms of native biodiversity and wildlife abundance. So it is incredibly important from a conservation biology standpoint to actually have the snag forest habitat on the landscape. Next slide, please. And I'm going to talk briefly about something that I call the bed and breakfast effect. My colleagues and I have done some research on California spotted owls and the other spotted owl subspecies, actually. And it turns out that, yes, they definitely need dense old forest for nesting and also for roosting. So areas that are lightly burned or moderately burned in fires or haven't burned in a long time. But they go out of their way to forage, to hunt in the snag forest habitat. In fact, they will oftentimes set up a nest territory on the edge of snag forest habitat, right where the low and moderate intensity transitions into the high intensity, because they get everything they need. They have the bed, which is their nest roost habitat, and they have the breakfast, which is the snag forest habitat. And these photos show basically a family of spotted owls that left unburned old growth forest and moved into a fire area the year after the fire, specifically to take advantage of the snag forest. They set up a new territory and they've been productive ever since. Next slide, please. And the reason for that is that snag forest habitat has small mammal prey biomass that is 2 to 6 times higher than the adjacent unburned old forest. And that makes it especially important for reproduction. Next slide. And of course, snag forest habitat is important for large mammals as well. Deer, elk, bears benefit from snag forest in myriad ways and tend to find more food and oftentimes higher quality food in the snag forest than in the unburned portion of the landscape. Next slide. I think that one's blank. Next slide. There we go. The other question that comes up a lot is, well, if you have an area of snag forest, a high intensity fire patch that's very large, what happens there? Can the forest possibly regenerate? And I'm going to go through a number of examples of this. And the answer is yes. These forests are regenerating wonderfully and vigorously. And this is a very large high intensity fire patch in the middle of the rim fire. And I took this picture at 5 years post-fire, and you see all the wonderful pine and fir regeneration amidst the snags. Next slide, please. This one I took just last fall. This is my colleague Maya Kosla, who does a lot of field work with me. She's a wildlife biologist and environmental filmmaker. And you can see that this is at now just not even 8 years post-fire, about 7.5 years post-fire, we took this picture. And a lot of the conifer regeneration is already, double over the top of her head. Next slide, please. And there's me showing more natural conifer regeneration. A lot of this is 11 or 12 feet tall already at only 7.5 years post-fire. And this is all natural regeneration. And this is a very large, high-intensity fire patch. This particular patch was over 1,000 acres in size. Next slide, please. And this one is near and dear to my heart. This is actually Fish Creek in the lake fire in the San Gorgonio wilderness. My wife took this picture of me standing in this natural aspen regeneration in the Snag forest habitat patch. And I believe that was at 4 years post-fire, if I recall correctly. But you can see, obviously, it's already quite tall. It's much taller now. Next slide, please. And I also did a number of surveys in the mountain fire of 2013 up in the Tahquitz wilderness area and also the May Valley area near Idlewild. And what I found was interesting. A lot of these forests, they were not particularly dense even at the time of the fire, but the post-fire regeneration was a little bit higher than the pre-fire tree density. And of course, not all the regeneration will survive. Trees will compete as they get taller and mature, but most is growing very, very vigorously and is quite healthy. And these areas of large, high-intensity fire patches in the mountain fire regenerating just wonderfully in the wilderness area. Next slide, please. And in the lower elevation forests outside the wilderness area, down in the May Valley area, I was finding the same thing, low density of regeneration, but higher than the pre-fire density, because this was a very, very low density forest, very open. A lot of it was grass and chaparral before the fire. And what's coming in after the fire is, kind of an open forest, slightly denser than it was pre-fire, but very, very similar. Next slide. And this is more natural post-fire conifer regeneration in the rim fire. These are Ponderosa Pine saplings growing through the montane chaparral and up under the snags. This is in the middle of the largest high-intensity fire patch in the rim fire, actually one of the two largest. It's the largest one in the southern half of the fire. And we just published, my colleague Tanya Chi and I just published a study a few weeks ago. We can't find a single acre at this point within the largest high-intensity fire patches that do not have conifer regeneration. And it's highly variable. In some places it's lower density, in some places it's very dense. But this notion that there are vast areas that simply don't have any regeneration is not at all what we've been finding. Next slide. And this just shows the same thing. This area is denser regeneration. It just shows the variability that you get. Very, very strong mix of species: sugar pine, ponderosa pine, incense cedar, white fir. Next slide. And this is what happens when post-fire logging occurs. This area was clear cut after about 1.5 years after the rim fire occurred, based on the assumption that the forest would not regenerate and that the fuel, that's what they call the snags, they call it fuel, needs to be removed, and the area needs to be sprayed with toxic herbicides like glyphosate and then artificially planted. But in so many cases, what happens is the natural processes are disrupted. The logging equipment rolls over and kills nearly all of the natural conifer regeneration that's already coming in. And it converts it to an arid, basically lifeless landscape that is dominated by invasive grasses like cheatgrass, bare ground, and some logging slash debris. I took this photo at 4 years after the logging occurred, and it still looks like this. And basically, it was damaged so badly by the logging that almost nothing is growing in there except for the invasive grasses. Next slide. And this is a serious, serious threat because of the misunderstanding about snag forest habitat. And a lot of these assumptions and misconceptions that high intensity fire patches are unnatural, or that forests won't regenerate after a large high intensity fire patch. A lot of those misconceptions are driving these misguided and destructive policies. And what you get is a wonderful, rich, naturally regenerating, biodiverse ecosystem turned into essentially an ecological wasteland, like this photo shows here, where the snag forest habitat was clear cut. So the snags and the natural regeneration of the shrubs, the entire system was hauled away to be incinerated in a biomass energy facility, what we call clear cuts for kilowatts. And this is a growing threat on public lands in the Western United States. This is national forest lands just west of Yosemite National Park, where this is happening. Next slide. And this is more of that. These pictures are of the post-fire logging in the rim fire, and you can just see the damage caused by these misguided policies, and by, of course, economic opportunism, because the logging companies make a lot of money off the dead trees, off the fire-killed trees, for lumber in the first 2 years after the trees are killed by the fire, and then for biomass, for energy production, essentially incinerating trees like giant sticks of coal in the years after that. Next slide. And of course, this is a climate change nightmare. It's not just ecologically damaging, it's a climate change nightmare, because most of that carbon and the trees that are removed is going up into the atmosphere. And in many cases, you have entire landscapes that are being stripped away by these post-fire logging operations. And it's being done deceptively at taxpayer expense under the guise of restoration, fuel reduction, and even reforestation. That is what that picture there is being called by land management agencies like the U.S. Forest Service. Next slide, please. We found, my colleagues and I did research on California spotted owls, and we found that because of this bed and breakfast effect, snag forest is really important to spotted owls. And what happens is, if even a relatively small portion of it is removed in a spotted owl's territory, occupancy plummets. It declines severely. And you can see that the orange bar on the left is unlogged areas, territories that have significant high intensity fire, but had little or no post-fire logging. And the bar on the right, which is much, much lower occupancy, is territories that had post-fire logging. At least 5% of the snag forest habitat was logged. And so 5% may seem like a small number, but it's not small to the spotted owls. Next slide, please. And the other thing that's happening on national forests and also on private lands is extensive commercial thinning. And the word thinning is really misleading to a lot of folks, because when people hear that term thinning, they think of people out there with pruning shears, so they think maybe a couple of shrubs are being removed, maybe some seedlings or saplings. In reality, the vast majority of the time, a thinning operation on national forests in California is a pretty intensive industrial logging operation where in most cases, 60 or 70% of the trees in the stand are killed and removed, including many of the mature and even some old growth trees. And this is being done based upon the claim or the assumption that these logging operations will curb or stop wildland fire. Problem is, not only is this logging degrading habitat and putting a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, it's not stopping wildland fires. And in fact, in many cases, they're burning more intensely when fires occur. Next slide, please. But in the meantime, between when the logging happens under the guise of thinning and when a fire occurs, mostly it's just most of the elements, the habitat elements, most of the complexity, the structure that literally defines a forest ecosystem is removed by these thinning operations. And all you really have is just sort of bare ground and widely spaced mature trees, but the understory is mostly gone. The snags are mostly gone, the down logs, the shrub patches, all the complexity and richness that the biodiversity is associated with is significantly diminished and if not outright removed. Next slide, please. And this has implications for spotted owls as well, because it's degrading that nesting and roosting habitat that they need, that we call, the bed in the bed and breakfast equation. And so, research indicates that there, can be a 43% loss of spotted owl occupancy after thinning because of that. Next slide. And this is a really key point because these logging operations, both post-fire logging and commercial thinning, are being conducted under the rubric of fuel reduction and restoration, very often fuel reduction and forest health. And the reality is that when wildland fires occur, sometimes these areas will burn at low intensity. That happens, certainly, but oftentimes they burn at the same or higher intensities as the unlogged areas. Next slide. And in fact, my colleagues and I conducted the largest scientific analysis ever conducted on this question. The entire Western United States, 3 decades of data, over 1,500 fires, comprising 23 million acres of fire areas in the frequent fire forest types. And what we found is that forests with the fewest environmental protections and the most logging burn the most intensely. And oftentimes those are fires that are burning intensely toward communities. And so the fuel reduction paradigm is not standing up well to scientific scrutiny. What we found in this study, which is Bradley et al. 2016, is that the dominant drivers of fire behavior are weather and climate variables. It's not about how dense the forest is or how protected it is from environmental regulations and laws. And in fact, the most protected forests, the ones with the fewest trees removed, tend to burn at lower intensities. Next slide. And we saw the tragic consequences of that in the fall of 2018 in the Camp Fire, which burned through several thousand acres that had been heavily logged after an earlier fire in the previous years. Dead trees were removed, live trees were removed. Post-fire logging occurred on private lands and public lands. Commercial thinning occurred. This was one of the most heavily logged landscapes in the northern Sierra Nevada. And that's what the Camp Fire burned through by far the fastest in those fateful first 6 hours, and then ultimately claimed 85 lives and over 14,000 homes. And the Camp Fire burned much faster through those logged areas than it otherwise would have. And so people had a lot less time to evacuate, and with tragic consequences. Next slide. And interestingly, a lot of folks think that fire severity is increasing in our forests. And we are seeing an incremental increase in annual area burned since the 1970s and 1980s. But interestingly, we're not seeing an increase in fire severity. In fact, most studies find that fire severity is not increasing in our forests, even as the annual area burned is inching upwards and getting a little bit closer to historical normal levels. There was an increase from the 1980s into the 1990s, but after that, it's been pretty flat. And this is research from my colleague, Dr. Della Sala, Dr. Dominic Della Sala and I. We published this in 2019. Next slide. And then, one thing I just want to mention for context is there's a lot of assumptions out there that we have too much snag forest habitat, because we've heard about the dead trees in the southern Sierra Nevada during the drought, and a lot of people had this idea that most of the trees were killed. In reality, that was just the result of over-reporting by aerial surveys that were surveying the same area year after year, and were double, triple, even quadruple overcounting the same snags. When subsequent studies came in, and there's a whole series of these that use remote sensing in a single time period after this pulse of snag recruitment, in other words, this tree mortality occurred, it turns out that there's only about 10 to 15% tree mortality in these forests on average. And of course, there was a wide range. At small spatial scales, some areas had 80 or 90 or even 100% tree mortality, and many areas had 5% or less. But on average, it was much, much lower than people realized. And so the areas of actual snag forest habitat, where most of the trees were killed by the drought and native bark beetles, was actually relatively small spatially. And when you add that to the areas killed by high intensity fire in recent decades, next slide, please. It turns out that snag forest habitat only comprises about 10% of the forests in the Sierra Nevada. And that's before you factor in post-fire logging, which has been extensive in many of these areas. So in reality, it's less than that. But if there was no post-fire logging, it would be about 10% of the forest. Historically, our reconstructions from many different studies and different authors using different methodologies, they coalesce around the figure that it was around 22 to 39%, somewhere in that range, depending on the time period and the region of the Sierra Nevada historically. So even though we have seen an increase in snag forest habitat in recent years from drought and from wildland fires, we are still significantly below natural levels. Now, of course, I stress this because it's really important to understand we don't want too much or too little snag forest habitat. We don't want it to be 60% of the forest in the landscape when historically it was 22 to 39%. But at the same time, if it increases from the current level of 10% up to 15 or even 20%, we shouldn't lament that and consider it a loss or a threat to the forest. That's actually an important restoration of ecological processes and heterogeneity and habitat. Next slide. And so the last thing I'll mention just briefly is, the importance of protecting forests to mitigate the climate crisis. This is so key. And the fact is that we cannot overcome the climate crisis only by getting away from fossil fuels. That's essential, but it's not enough because the residence time of CO2 in the atmosphere is incredibly long once we put the excess CO2 up there from fossil fuel burning and from logging. And so we need to do both. We need to get away from fossil fuels and we need to substantially increase protection of our forests in order to draw down more atmospheric carbon and overcome the climate crisis. Next slide. And I'm one of over 200 US ecologists and climate scientists that recently sent a letter to Congress making this, drawing this conclusion and urging them to move away from legislation that would further subsidize or encourage or facilitate logging operations on public or private lands, and instead to move in the opposite direction towards increased protection of forests and a shift away from wood consumption over time, just as we're shifting away from fossil fuel consumption. Next slide. And of course, for more information, I've got a new book coming out in late May called Smokescreen. And then there's also my 2015 book that I co-authored with Dr. De La Sala called The Ecological Importance of Mixed Severity Fires, Nature's Phoenix. And I'd be happy to take questions.
Well, that was fantastic. Dr. Hansen, you did a great job. I've heard the talk now 3 times and I get something out of it every single time. Just really well done. I also wanted to thank you for your pitches for the spotted owl. Back in the 1970s and 80s, I was one of those people that was figuring out how important their roost sites were. And I was real happy that you mentioned that. A lot of the research I was doing at that point was in the coast redwood forest, which is in many ways similar, but also a bit different from the forest that you're talking about. One of the things that was so striking in working in that forest was that the trees are, first of all, they're huge, but second of all, they have huge fire scars. Almost every big tree has multiple fire scars, which tells me that they have experienced very large fires, not just creeping fires that would have gone, sneaking around underneath the canopy, but things that the fire length must have extended 30, 40, 50 feet up to create the fire scars that we saw. I was just wondering if the kind of work you're doing, which sounds like it's mostly focused in the Sierra Nevada or the Colorado Plateau type forests, whether or not that same pattern applies to the moister coast redwood and Douglas fir forests.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so those four, the coast redwoods are also a mixed severity fire regime. The mix is not the same necessarily as other forest types, so some mixed severity fire regimes are weighted more towards moderate and high, and some are weighted more towards low and moderate. But it's definitely a mixed severity fire regime. High severity fire was never the majority historically, but it was a significant component. And so you not only had those areas that you described where the flames would go up 40 or 50 feet up the tree and would kill a lot of the smaller trees and scorch the big ones, but you would also have crown fire that would kill the mature trees, and you would have a new stand regenerating in those areas. And so, yeah, it's a much more heterogeneous fire regime than I think people realized in the past, and which makes it interesting and dynamic.
Great, thank you. Well, I think Colin Barrows is going to go through the Q&A. It looks like there's at least 3 questions in there. So Colin, if you want to take over, go ahead.
Sure. I think I was going to start off with a question too. So, well, I have a bunch of questions. It was a great talk, first of all. I guess maybe the question I'd like to at least start with is about you mentioned a little bit about Native American cultural burning and management of forests, maybe pre-European arrival. Does your research address that at all, or do you have a feeling about whether that is that kind of like the model for what we should be returning to, or a good practice that we should be incorporating into forest management, or how would you incorporate that?
No, it's a great question. Yeah, so there, as far as Native American cultural burning, I'm really relying on the scholarship of Native American experts and academics who have done this work, both from a traditional ecological knowledge standpoint, and also, from an academic standpoint in terms of just Western science, gathering these data and publishing it, and collecting oral history information. And so really what's emerging from this is very, very important. And there's a lot of research on this that others have done that have looked at both, mixed intensity wildland fire from lightning and climate, patterns and fluctuations back through time, as well as the influence of Native American cultural burning, and then the impact on that of colonization, and then more recently, fire suppression and suppression of Native American cultural burning. And for me, I guess the main thing that I think is so important about this is that we had, and this is what multiple studies are showing this, both from non-Indigenous scholars and Indigenous scholars, is that we had historically, before fire suppression, before forced removal of Native Americans from ancestral lands, we had substantially more Native American cultural burning than we do now. And we had substantially more mixed intensity wildland fire. Both were more prevalent. Both have been suppressed by colonization and by the last century plus of forest management practices. And I think the answer is we need more of both moving forward.
More of both. Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go through a few of the questions in the Q&A. If anybody else has more questions, go ahead and add them now. The first question is about snag forests in other climates, or maybe other parts of the world, such as the Amazon rainforest in Australia, demonstrate a similar pattern of fires. So, I mean, they've been in the news a lot lately, so maybe address some of that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the Amazon is a unique circumstance because a lot of the burning, excuse me, a lot of the burning happening there is not wildland fire. I mean, there is wildland fire in Amazonia, and it's actually, there is a natural fire regime there. But a lot of the burning that's happening there is actually associated with deliberate deforestation by logging and livestock grazing entities that are deliberately deforesting the landscape and bulldozing the trees and cutting them down and then piling them, applying accelerant, and then setting the area on fire just to get all of the trees in the forest out of there so they can, introduce massive numbers of cattle. And so I think that's actually where fire is being applied in anthropogenic, a very destructive anthropogenic way, to facilitate deforestation, to feed the global appetite for beef, which we need to rethink. But But it is interesting to know that there is a natural fire regime in Amazonia, and there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the different types of vegetation and the different types of fire. There have been some really, really good paleo-ecological studies using charcoal sediments going back thousands of years. And it's interesting because there was a real significant mix of indigenous burning and also burning from natural ignitions that varied significantly over time, depending on what the climate was doing at any given point in time. Now, there are also lots of forest ecosystems around the world that have natural mixed intensity fire regimes that are in many ways very similar to our mixed conifer forests here in the West, like a lot of the forests in Southeast Australia, for example. A lot of the mountain ash forests are mixed severity fire regime. And then, of course, in boreal forests around the world, it's mostly a higher intensity fire regime.
Great. Next question is from Bettina, and she asks about, can you talk about controlled burns on preservation land for biodiversity increase? And does it increase biodiversity of insects and small mammals? I think you talked about small mammals, but maybe insects and controlled burns in general.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So under the heading, a lot of people call it, sometimes we call it controlled burns, or sometimes we call it prescribed burns, more commonly prescribed burning. And I think I would make a couple of points there. For decades, there have been two different categories of prescribed burning. The first category is actually prescribed natural fires, which are lightning strikes, where agencies, state or federal, make an administrative decision to not suppress the fire for ecosystem benefit. And so you will get to mix of intensities because these are lightning strikes that occur during fire season. And we call that prescribed natural fire. These days, the terminologies change a little bit, and a lot of people call it managed wildfire, but we used to call it prescribed natural fire. Then we have human set prescribed burns, where folks with drip torches. And I guess I would say this, is that there is a strong consensus in the scientific community among fire ecologists and forest ecologists that we need a lot more prescribed natural fire, otherwise known as managed wildfire. There's a lot more controversy about human set prescribed fires. And the main reason for that is, in almost every case, they are set outside of natural fire season, either in the spring before fire season or in the fall after fire season is basically over. And the problem is you do not mimic the natural heterogeneity and mix of fire intensities that you get in a natural fire or prescribed natural prescribed fire or a managed wildfire. You don't get that mix of fire intensities, and you don't get the snag forest habitat. You get a homogeneous low intensity fire effect, and that's not natural. The other thing that happens is that it disrupts the entire chain of ecological events in the forest. So for example, wood boring beetles are not active outside of fire season. I've actually worked with them physically. You can grab them, you can put them on your hand. And if you're at the cusp of fire season, like late May, and it's a relatively warm, sunny day, they'll move around, they'll move their wings, and they'll get ready to fly. And if the sun goes behind a cloud, immediately the temperature drops, it's cool, and that beetle will stop moving. It's like you pressed a pause button. And so the problem is that when you do prescribe fire outside of natural fire season, the wood boring beetles are not active. They don't colonize the fire area. The woodpeckers show up because they have an evolutionary history knowing that if there's a fire, they're going to get food there. But we're disrupting that natural evolutionary history when we do things outside of the natural fire season. So the woodpeckers show up, they set up a territory, there's no food, and they starve. And then you get a cascading series of effects of that on secondary cavity nesters. So it can actually be very, very damaging in ways that we weren't even thinking about until more recently. A colleague of mine, Chris Rhoda, did some wonderful research on this in the Black Hills of South Dakota, just as one example.
Great. We have a question here about the Woolsey Fire in Malibu, and was asking if you looked at that fire in particular. I guess there was no logging in the area, and they wanted to know if there was a difference there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the Woolsey Fire has come up a lot, and I know the Woolsey Fire, and I've been through it. I haven't done any research there. I've just driven through and hiked through a little bit. But I will say, I mean, it's important because the Woolsey Fire did not occur in conifer forest. There's not a single acre of conifer forest in the Woolsey Fire that I'm aware of. It's grassland, it's chaparral, it's some oak woodland. And so it's really important to realize that, because oftentimes I think in the media discussion on these issues, and oftentimes by policymakers, they create the impression that all the fires are happening in conifer forests. And in the state of California, in any given year, typically the majority of the acres burned are not in conifer forests, and oftentimes are nowhere near the nearest conifer forest. And that's the case with the Woolsey Fire. I did see one thing that was interesting that kind of piqued my curiosity. It seems that the National Park Service in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area is reporting really significant, and I think record numbers of mountain lion reproduction after the Woolsey Fire, after a couple of years after the Woolsey Fire, which is really encouraging because it's a small population, it's an isolated population, and there's a lot of concern about it from a conservation biology standpoint. But it turns out the lions seem to be doing quite well after the Woolsey Fire, and I suspect there's something roughly analogous to the bed and breakfast effect going on there too.
That's great to hear. And then one more question from Bettina. Can you define fire suppression?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sorry. Fire suppression is basically the practice of state and federal agencies of putting out fires when they start in those low fire weather conditions, which is the only time it's possible to put out fires. In other words, when it's relatively cool, it's not particularly windy, and it's not especially hot. Now, 97% of ignitions in our forests are put out before they can even become fires of any significance. These are typically, a tenth of an acre, a quarter of an acre, a 1/100th of an acre, oftentimes a single tree. They're ignitions. And, historically, before fire suppression policies, which we're spending billions of dollars every year on fire suppression, in most cases, trying to fight weather-driven fires that cannot possibly be stopped no matter how much money you spend, because essentially you're trying to fight the wind, and no one can stand on a ridge and fight the wind. And you're not going to stop weather-driven fires with bulldozers and air tankers, and you're not going to stop them with chainsaws because weather and climate are overriding factors. But historically, the way it worked is you'd have an ignition in the spring when it's low fire weather, relatively cool and not very windy, not very hot, and not very dry. And then that ignition would just sort of barely creep along for weeks. Then you get into the summer and you get a hot, dry, windy spell of time, and it would move very quickly and become a larger mixed intensity fire, sometimes very large. But now the vast majority of fires never get the chance to even become more than an acre in size, because they're put out at the only time when you can do that. They're like not even like, they're barely moving. You've got flames that are a couple inches tall. You could put them out with your boots. So yeah.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions I think we'll I'll kind of wrap together here into our last question about if different agencies that are involved in fire management, I guess the Forest Service and CAL FIRE, and is there anything that we can do as citizens to encourage better forest management practices among those agencies?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I would say, contact your members of Congress, contact your U.S. senators, contact your congressional representative, and ask them to please stop funding logging on national forests under these misleading euphemisms like fuel reduction, forest health. Ask them to get the U.S. Forest Service out of the commercial logging business. What a lot of people don't realize is that the number one thing the U.S. Forest Service does is sell public timber to private logging companies and keep the revenue for its budget. So it's literally in the commercial logging business. I believe, and hundreds of my colleagues believe, that we need to get the federal land management agencies like the Forest Service out of the logging business. But we also need better protections on private lands. And right now, many of our policymakers, who, including those who are saying they take climate change seriously, they're moving in the wrong direction, including our governor, Gavin Newsom. He's promoting subsidies for logging on private lands and on public lands. And he's very much promoting policies that are strongly against the emerging consensus from the scientific community among forest ecologists and climate scientists.
Great. So everybody go do that. I want to thank you again for your presentation and sharing your knowledge with us. And let's see, I want to remind everyone or have everybody save the date, I guess, for our next Wild Coachella presentation, which will be on Earth Day, April 22nd. And will be about using dogs, service dogs, for invasive species control here locally, I think. So that's a really exciting topic. And also remind everybody to take part in the Wild Coachella Challenge by getting out in the Coachella Valley, maybe in some of the local wildfire areas that we've had here in the last few years, and make some observations for iNaturalists, and those will be included in the Wild Coachella Challenge. We've had about 5,000 observations so far this month, and we're about halfway through the month, right? So we'll try to get to 10,000. Other than that, I think we're about good, right?
Chad, thank you very much. It was a great presentation, and I'm seeing the comments coming in right now. I think it's unanimous. Everybody thought you did a fantastic job. So thank you very much.
Well, it was my pleasure. It's always fun. I'd be happy to come back and talk to you all again if you like at some point in the future. And thanks for the great questions.
Great. I was gonna just add something to one of your slides about the importance of the snags and the holes that the woodpeckers make, and make the tie into spotted owls in the Sierra Nevada, as well as in the Coast Range, but mostly in the Sierra Nevada. One of their preferred food items is the flying squirrel. And flying squirrels are only there if they're snags with holes in them. So without a snag forest, you will remove the spotted owl's preferred prey items.
That's absolutely right. And this is why, for me, the message is that this sort of notion that we've been told, and conveyed to us for decades and generations, that a healthy forest is an orderly, structured forest, with evenly spaced trees, and it's almost all live green trees, and there's very little understory. That's actually a very, very ecologically depauperate forest. That's a forest with very little wildlife, very little biodiversity. And an ecologically healthy forest, if you're going to use that term, biodiverse forest, is a forest that has that kind of messy look to it. It's complex. There's down logs. They're leaning over each other. There's small trees. There's big trees. There's heterogeneity in terms of the density. Some areas very dense. Some areas a little more open. There's patches of shrubs and there's wildflowers. There's all that complexity in the forest, because that complexity and that structure is basically what the wildlife depend on. And you're absolutely right about the flying squirrels and the snags, and that relationship between, natural disturbance processes that kill a tree, the wood boring beetles and the other native beetles like bark beetles that create the food for the woodpeckers, and then creating the cavities that then flying squirrels use and then provide food for the spotted owls.
Exactly. The other thing I was going to mention, or I guess, is that I've talked to you a little bit in the past about I think it's called the mountain fire that was up in the San Jacinto Mountains 13 years ago, I guess, or thereabouts. And I've been tracking wildlife responses along the Spittler Peak Trail for I guess it was the last 7 years, I suppose. So it was 7 years ago. It was in 2013 was when the fire. And there was this, as no surprise to you, that the fire following plants and the insects associated with it were tremendous for the first 6 or 7 years, 6 years anyway, after the fire. And the lizard population, which is one of the things that we're tracking, just was doubled and tripled in size. It was just tremendous. But I got a feeling this last year that it was starting to slow down and sort of going back towards the pre-fire situation. With the fire following plants were few and far between. The insects were fewer and farther between. The lizard population seems a little bit smaller. What do you think that a fire return frequency should be for that kind of habitat?
Yeah, it's a great question. Okay, so historically, the research is coalescing around the conclusion that the fire rotation interval, and I purposefully use that term, the fire rotation interval, because that's the actual metric that really is spatially explicit.
Right.
Which really pertains to, on average, you could just look at as how often did fire occur on any given acre or patch of ground or any given point location. The fire rotation interval in the mixed conifer forests and Ponderosa pine and Jeffrey pine forests in Southern California mountains was generally around 55 years historically before fire suppression, which is really interesting because we thought for a long time that it was very, very frequent, that it was maybe 8 years or 12 years. And that's because we were using fire scar intervals, but we weren't taking into account the fact that those fire scars only represented a small portion of the study landscape. And it might have only been 5% of that study landscape burned in a given year, and we were assuming it was the entire landscape. And so other subsequent research has corrected that by looking at fire rotation interval. And so I think, basically in that 50 to 60 year range for these relatively moderately frequent fire forest types. In the Sierra Nevada, same forest types, it was around 30 to 40 years in most cases, some cases 20 to 25, in some cases 40 or 50. But the bottom line is that it was mostly low and moderate with a significant percentage of high intensity in that, somewhere 15 to 25 or 30% range in most cases, sometimes higher, sometimes less. And I think if you have that, you're going to have a really, really rich, dynamic, biodiverse ecosystem. Now, again, you don't want to overshoot the mark. You don't want too much, or you don't want too little. But I think what most people don't realize is that we still have much too little in our forest ecosystems. I will say, though, one of the very few places, forested regions in the entire Western United States, where we are pretty close to the natural range of variability is Southern California mountains.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, in fact, I would say it's one of only two, one researcher divided the West into 42 regions in terms of the frequent fire forest types, subregions mostly. And out of 42, there were only 2 that were within the natural range, and Southern California mountains is one of them. So I would say it's the exception to the rule. We don't have an overabundance. We don't have too much fire in these mountains, but we don't have a deficit really either. It's one of the few places where that's true.
Nice. Well, I want to give you a chance to get some dinner, but I thank you very much again. I think based on what I'm seeing on the screen, a lot of the participants are listening to our conversation still here, but
oh, great.
Thank you again. And hopefully we'll get you back again in a year or two so you can give us an update on your research.
I would be happy to.
Great.
Thank you. Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you very much, Chad. Bye-bye.